Well, the clock on the wall says 9 o'clock. My watch says 9 o'clock, so I guess we'll start. It's good to see all of you here this morning. Beautiful, almost fall morning. Milder temperatures are on their way. We can take them. Glad to have them. We're in the 16th chapter of 1 Corinthians. If you want to be turning there, I want to express my appreciation to Chris again for teaching for me last week so that I could go and visit with my daughter and see my 2 grandchildren and my 8 great-grandchildren while I was there, and several granddogs. It's always fun. Now, we're going to have to use our memories and go back 2 weeks. You remember we ended the class having read the first, I think, 2 or 3 verses of the chapter talking about concerning the collection for the saints. We find out that Paul had given command not only to this congregation, but to all the other churches that he'd been visiting, that they were to lay by in store on the first day of the week. And the Amplified says every first day of the week, which that is implied in the text. And so we know that this is God's will for financing the church is through free will offerings, not garage sales, yard sales, bake sales, or whatever else that might come to mind that people might come up with as what they think is a good project. But it's a free will offering, and that's to be done on a regular weekly basis. And of course, when this contribution is being collected, there is a specific purpose in mind. Another thing that it points out is that this is a cooperative effort from a cooperative effort of many, many congregations and Christians all over the world, of the known world. You know, there's been some questions as whether congregations can cooperate with one another on any kind of project. Well, this is certainly an example of that. Paul's going around collecting money, and it was for a specific purpose. And this was the purpose of relieving the poor saints that were in Jerusalem and Judea. And we pointed out that in Acts, when Paul and Barnabas were working with the church in Antioch, Agabus, a prophet came from Jerusalem up there, and he gave this prophecy concerning the very severe famine that was going to hit Jerusalem and Judea. And at that point, the brethren in Antioch decided, yes, they were going to send a collection. They sent it by the hands of Paul and Barnabas at that particular time. But then as Paul and Barnabas go on their missionary journey, then he's collecting more funds. This was going to last a while. I'm not for sure that we're told how many years that famine lasted, but this was what was in mind. And so he is telling them to get the collection ready. He had bragged about them being willing and ready to do it when he was going through Achaia prior to that, and he lets them know he doesn't want to be disappointed. This comes to us in the second book, that he wants them to fulfill what they've promised they would do. The question came up, thanks to Brother Jimmy up here, about our giving. And he referenced a passage that comes from Matthew, the 5th chapter, beginning with verse 17, talking about the righteousness of the Christians should exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees or the Jews. We'll look at that a little bit later, and we'll go to and look at the context. But his question was, does that apply to their method of giving? So I did several things in getting ready for the lesson. First of all, I just got to thinking about wealth and our attitude toward wealth. We know that the love of money is the root of all evil. Money itself is not. And we have many examples of people that are wealthy in the Bible. And I just started listing the ones that we know were very wealthy, and these were considered to be godly men. Abraham, very wealthy, had immense flocks and herds, silver, gold, servants. He raised a force of 300 men of his own servants within his own household. That gives you a little bit of idea of his prominence and his wealth. For him to be able to do that when he goes and delivers Lot and the people from Sodom and Gomorrah after they'd been conquered by this group of kings that came in, took all the captives, and Lot and his family were among them. Lot had wealth. He was Abraham's nephew, his brother's son, traveled with him when he left the Ur of the Chaldees, and then later Haran as he left there after Terah, his father, died. Lot goes along with him. Well, by the time they get into the land of Canaan, what we're told about them is he had so much wealth that his shepherds, his herdsmen, his flocks couldn't stay close to Abraham's because the land could not support them. And that's when Abraham says, well, you look around and you just choose wherever you go, I'll go the other direction. And you remember, we're told that Lot looked to the Jordan Valley. The Jordan flows into the Dead Sea. There's a great grazing there. So he chose the valley of the Jordan going down toward the Dead Sea and the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's where he chose. And so then Abraham stays on the west side of the Jordan River. He looks at, and this is when God says, you look around, this is all going to be your possession, your family's possession. And so we know that Lot was a wealthy man. And so their descendants, Isaac inherited what had been his father's. Jacob inherited what was Isaac's. And so the process goes on and on and on. This whole generation. We know that Job, who was probably a contemporary of Abraham, we believe, not of the Jewish race, not of Abraham's seed, but was a great wealthy man. All you have to do is go to the book of Job and read about all that his wealth. Now, he lost everything, but then it was restored to him. He ended up more than he had before he lost everything. And so Job was a very prominent man, very wealthy. Then you have Joseph. Of course, Joseph started out in prison when his brother sold him into slavery. He was a slave, and of course, he was blessed by God. He raised to prominence in the household of Potiphar, but then because of Potiphar's wife's lie about him, he ended up in Pharaoh's prison for chief prisoners. And of course, he raises even to preeminence there, being put in charge of all the prisoners. But we know that he is eventually released, and he raises to preeminence to the second Pharaoh. You think he had at his fingertips, wealth. He was married. 2 sons were born to him. So yes, he was a very wealthy, prominent man. Then you look at David, Solomon. Of course, Solomon's described as the wealthiest man to ever live. Had more gold and silver. Silver was as prominent as gravel was in his kingdom while he was reigning. Then you have men like Mordecai, who's the Jews who's raised preeminence, second to Ahasuerus, the king at that particular time, the Persian king. You have Nehemiah being wealthy enough that he supported from his own means. Of course, he's cupbearer for the Persian king, and as such would have had wealth. He sent as a governor back to Palestine to help restore the walls to the city. And while he's there, we're told that he supplied the food for everyone that went with him. He did not take the money that was normally paid to the governor from the taxes that were collected. So he had to have wealth. In the New Testament, you have men like Cornelius. Cornelius was a captain of 100. He's a centurion in the Roman guard. We're told that he gave much alms to the Jewish people, the poor people. To have money to give to the alms, and much alms means that you've got a good degree of wealth. And then you have Barnabas. We don't know, he's not described as a wealthy man, but we know he had land and possessions because he sells it, gives his money to take care of the widows, orphans, and poor there in Jerusalem, and providing housing for those that were there that had come for Pentecost and remained. So you have all of these examples. God is not against wealth. What's the question is, how do you use it? How do you use it? Both Cornelius and Barnabas are described as men who were willing to give generously, and so that's a good thing for us to remember. When was tithing instituted? Or let me rephrase it. When was tithing first mentioned? Do any of you remember? You may say, well, we'll look at Leviticus and the law and maybe the book of Deuteronomy. Guess what? It precedes that. The first time that you have tithing being mentioned, it's mentioned back in chapter 14 of Genesis, verse 20. And this is when Abraham and his troops, along with the Amorites that went with him, they defeated these kings that had conquered Sodom and Gomorrah, and they took a lot of spoils of war with them from these kings that had fought against Sodom and Gomorrah. And on their way back home, they run into Melchizedek, priest of God, priest of Salem. And on that occasion, we're told that Abraham gave a tenth of all the spoils of war that they took, gave it to this priest. That's the first time you have tithing being mentioned. It's also mentioned again in the book of Genesis. This comes from chapter 28, verse 22. And you'll remember that when Jacob fled Esau's anger, and his mother and father, Rebekah, is behind this and wanting to spare Jacob being killed by Esau. She, of course, told Isaac, I can't stand for Jacob to marry one of these Canaanite women. Esau had done that, and it grieved her and grieved Isaac as well. And so they agree to send then Jacob to Rebekah's brother, to where she came from. Laban is her brother and still living. Well, on his way, you'll remember that he went to sleep, and this is where he used the stone for a pillow. He sees the dream of the angels coming and going and this sort of thing, and God communicates with him there. And Jacob makes a vow. He says, if you will bring me back to my family and protect me, I will give you a tenth of all of my possessions. Second time we have tithing being mentioned. Now we have it actually literally instituted in the book of Deuteronomy. There's probably other places as well, but Deuteronomy chapter 14. If you want to turn there, verses 22 and 23 reads as follows. Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, of thy oil, of the firstlings of thy herd, and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. I like the way the Living Tyndale, or the Tyndale Living Bible, express this last phrase. The purpose of tithing is to teach yourselves to put God first in your life. I like the way that, of course, the other one says, that you're going to fear and respect and pay due homage to God, which that's good. Now, question concerns tithing and the Christian. Let's look at the New Testament. If you search the New Testament, you will not find any command to tithe in the New Testament. There is no command given in the New Testament to tithe. How do we take that? Let's look at some of the verses that have to do with giving. and maybe come up with some idea as far as what God expects of us as Christians and our giving. In Matthew 6, verse 2, this is concerning giving, and he says, don't blow a trumpet and don't make a big show of giving. In other words, when you give, it's between you and God, no one else. The giving is not motivated by putting on this big show. And then we have Mark 12, verse 14, and we'll kind of pull this back in with this also. In Mark 12, verse 44, you have the Lord and the disciples are sitting there where they can see people contributing to the treasury as they go into the temple. And there's this widow who gives the 2 mites, and the Lord looks at his disciples and he says, that woman has given more than any others. Well, there were also many others going in, wealthy, dressed to the hilt, and they were making a big show of how much they're giving, which he's already said back in Matthew 6, that's not to be the motive. And yet that's exactly what these other people were doing. And so then he makes a point. This woman gave far beyond. She gave all she had, all of her income. These others, he said, are just simply giving of their access, their abundance. They were not giving sacrificially at all. They weren't going to miss what they were giving. And that's the point that he's making. You have Luke 19, verse 8, and this is an example of someone who was giving and of a giving nature. This is the example of Zacchaeus. You remember after Jesus looks up, sees him and says, Zacchaeus, come down, I'm going to your house. And Zacchaeus is so happy. And you remember he was a tax collector, a publican, and they didn't have a very good reputation among the Jews because they were Jewish people, but they were representing the Roman government. They were collecting the taxes to pay to the Roman government, but they often took way more, and they would just become wealthy by abusing their position as a tax collector. They would set the rate very high, collect it, and then, of course, they would keep a lot for themselves. Zacchaeus evidently was a good-hearted man because he tells the Lord, he says, I'm giving half, 50% of all that I possess to the poor. So that's an example of someone giving in the New Testament. And then he says, if I have wronged anyone, in other words, if I have collected more tax than was legitimate, I'm going to restore it 4 times the amount. So that was the heart of Zacchaeus, and an example that we have of someone giving in the New Testament.
Man mentioned in Luke 18, verse 12, said, I fast twice a week and I give tithes of all that I've said. And we know
that was the Pharisee who was proud of himself. He was one of these that tooted his own horn. Look at what I'm doing and what I'm giving. You're right. You also have in Acts 20, verse 35, this is an admonition of the Apostle Paul. And basically he says you need to work, you work hard so that you will have money to give to the poor. As a Christian, that has got to be a concern, that we are willing to share what we have with those that are not as fortunate as we are. That's where he also says it's more blessed to give than to receive. And so the focus is away from self, greedy, all for me, give me, give me, give me, into what can I do for others. That then becomes a motive for our giving. Then in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 5, he's talking to the churches of Macedonia, or he's talking about the churches of Macedonia, the province of Greece that's to the north of Achaia, where Corinth is located. And he's using them as an example. And he says they first gave themselves, and then they gave to us out of their lack and their poverty. You remember they begged Paul to take a collection from them. He says, no, you don't need to do that. I don't want to take from you and have you giving to people and then you suffering? And they wouldn't listen. They said, no, you're going to take this offering. And so he uses them as an example of very sacrificial giving, going kind of back similar to the widow that gave the 2 mice. These people were not wealthy. They didn't have a lot, and yet they wanted to share in this blessing of giving. And so he uses them as an example. Then over in 2 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, verse 6, this is where he says, if you sow sparingly, you will reap sparingly. And he's applying it to giving. And so the idea is you cannot outgive God. The more generous you are in giving, the more generous he is going to give in the gifts that he's going to shower on you. It doesn't mean that it's all going to be monetary. So don't do like the televangelist now that says, give us seed money and you give it and you'll get 10 times that back within the next so many weeks. That's not what he's saying. But the principle is there. If you sow sparingly, if you're greedy, then you're not going to enjoy the blessings of God that God has available to you and is willing to shower on you abundantly. He also goes on concerning the giving, and he says it needs to be something that is planned or purposed. In other words, he's telling the Christian, when you give, it's not to be just something off the cuff that you just, oh, well, I've got an extra 20, I'll throw it in the collection plate. It's a matter that you sit down and you consider what your income is, what your set expenses are, and then plan your giving around that. And you do it first before you do all the excessive stuff, the things that you just do for recreation, the things that you don't really have to have, not the necessities of life. You determine your giving first, place God first. So it's something that you purpose and plan. And then he goes on to say you don't do it grudgingly or as if you just have to do it of necessity. You know, if you have that attitude when you give, is it going to do you any good? Is God going to bless? Now, the funds may do some good, but as far as you personally are concerned, you're not going to be blessed by God if that's the attitude you have. Well, here you are. I wished I could spend it on myself, but I've got to do it, you know. That's not the attitude. He said, but you give cheerfully. You're thankful that you have the privilege to give. You look at yourself and all that you have and say, I'm blessed by God. And I'm willing to share what I have. And it gives me joy to be able to help others. Now, that's the commands concerning giving. Now, as to the question of the tithing, let's go back to Matthew, the 5th chapter, and read 17 through 20, because this is the context that we find this phrase, unless your righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees, you're not going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. You remember that we did a lengthy study. Chris did this wonderful series of lessons on Matthew 5 and the Beatitudes and Christ's sermon here that he's given on the Mount. And one of the things that had happened because of his confrontation with the Jewish leaders who perceived that he was not obeying the traditions that they had set up. They accused him of not keeping the law. Christ obeyed the law perfectly. He did not keep all their traditions because their traditions violated the law. But they accused him of trying to destroy the law, not keeping it. And of course, then he says that's not true. And so you have him giving this statement beginning there with verse 17. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am come to destroy, not to destroy, but to fulfill. He came to fulfill. You look at the Old Testament, go through it, and guess what? All of it is pointed toward and looking to the coming of Jesus Christ, the Savior. He fulfilled the law and the prophets. Then he goes on, he says, for verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall not in no wise pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Now that's an interesting statement, because if that's what's going to happen, what of necessity is the conclusion that you make? Once it's fulfilled, it's going to pass away. And that we have, of course, given to us very eloquently in the book of Hebrews. The old law was terminal. It was intended to end, and the new law is better. It's got better promises, a better high priest, a better sacrifice, and you just go on and on. And of course, he deals in chapter 7, 8, 9 with the fact that the old covenant has got to end. The new covenant has come into place. It's been brought about by the death of Jesus. It's his will, his covenant now that is in effect. But then he goes on, verse 19, whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. So when he's making this comment, he's certainly not focused on giving. And if we do that and we narrow it down just to that application, then we're doing violation to the law, to what's being said here. That's not the context. He's looking at the entire law, the actual law and the prophets, not their tradition, not what they tacked on, but what God gave. And the Pharisees and the scribes were not keeping it. They were speaking and saying they claimed to be doing it, but they were not. And we see this all through Christ's confrontation with them at so many points. And it was evident they were not keeping the law. Even in Christ's trial, they tried him in violation of the law they supposedly were keeping. It was not to have been conducted at night. A witness was never supposed to have to witness against himself, and only on the testimony of two witnesses was anyone to be condemned. They couldn't find two witnesses that agreed, so there were no one to witness against him. That's when the high priest said, Jesus, are you the Son of God? And Jesus said, yes. And then that's when he said, he's committed blasphemy, he's worthy of death. And so it was a violation all the way around. And yet they claimed that they were keeping the law. And so Jesus is saying, unless you as Christians view the law that God is giving to you and you keep it sincerely from the heart, not like these people that do it just as a show and they're violating the very heart of the law. They've left righteousness and justice and all of that is at the core of the law to just do something that's superficial, that builds them up. It's all for self there. Then he says, you're not going to be able to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, does that include giving?
You're saying and keeping the law?
I'm just saying, would we of necessity exclude the giving?
The question you might ask it this way: does our giving? I say I'm going to say this now. Determine our righteousness.
It would be one element that would describe our righteousness. The Christian is to be loving, he's to be giving, generous, open-hearted to the needs of others. So it would be a barometer, let's say, of righteousness. Chris? Right. That's exactly right.
Choose to give.
Right. Right.
What do they call it? Prosperity doctrine or prosperity faith. The more you give to God, the more God's going to multiply it back to you. You know, that's a really big thing out there in the television evangelist world. You know,
Right.
Send it in here, put it into this prayer cloth, and it'll turn into money.
Yeah.
That's just like a person that's like we were talking earlier, that's wealth. that able to give enormous amounts of money to the church, would he be any more righteous than somebody that's of low income and gives meager?
If we were to describe a good Christian example, one of the things that we probably would mention would be how generous he was and how good he was to people who were in need. Just like Cornelius was described as a man who gave much alms. Joey, you had your hand up a while ago.
Kind of say what Chris said, that, giving doesn't make you righteous, but if you're righteous and you thanking God daily for what He has given you, and you look out for compassion and love for others, why in the world would you not be glad you could?
Right.
And God expects, I think, us to that.
Right. Do you remember Jesus saying, and this may come from the Sermon on the Mount, I'm not for sure, I know it's in Matthew, but he encouraged people to love like God loved, and God showered his love on the good and the bad. And he gave, not expecting, requiring necessarily anything. And that, he says, when you give, don't give to receive back. Don't just give to people that you know are going to return the favor, in other words. Your giving is to be generous in that way. Now, that's still going back to the question of tithing. I would say this, because of the examples that we have in the Old Testament, and they're just strictly examples, we have the command. The command, we don't go to the Old Testament to get our commands. But I would say that it is an example of an acceptable rate as far as God's concerned. Would you deny that, Chris?
I've heard this before. Trying to look it up. But they had 3 times in the Old Testament. They had the Levitical tithe that was supposed to support the workforce of the Levites. Then they had the festival or the festivities tithe that was supposed to be, more, I guess, elaborately spent, I guess is a word that you would use. And then they had the tithe for the poor that was supposed to be done every 3rd year, every 3 years. So the number that I kept seeing, looking this question up, how much did the children of Israel give as their offering, give as the tithe that's required, was 23%. Because if you take a tenth for the Levites, a tenth for the city, the festivals, all that stuff, and then a third, essentially, for the poor, they were the ones they were the ones responsible for welfare. The people were, not the government. The people were. So that percentage came out to 23%. Well, the same people that say we should go to the Old Testament to establish that 10% number don't want to go to 23%.
No, that's true.
All of the offerings. Incidental offerings that they had to make, like the lamb and all that other stuff. I mean, you're talking about a substantial amount of their increase. I don't know that we would use the word income, but their increase, it started at 23% and went up. So that 10% that we talk about is
maybe it ought to be considered a minimum amount. I don't know. There is no set amount, and so I want to get away from that. I'm just saying that is an acceptable rate as far as the Bible is concerned. And in my own personal life, I have considered that as a base and tried to go well beyond that. What I will say is that there is a principle that's given in Acts, and this would be concerning property and what you owned and this sort of thing. You remember when Ananias and Sapphira gave and claimed to give all that was the price that they received for land that they sold? They lied because they kept part of it back. Peter makes this comment, while the land was yours, was it not yours to do with as you pleased? After you sold it, was the amount not there yours and you could do with it as you please? What you've done is you've lied to God. You've claimed that you're giving everything. The sin was in the lie, not that they kept part of it back. And so the principle is we have possessions, we have our wealth and so on, and it is ours to do with as we desire and as we plan. But then take into consideration all these other verses that we have concerning giving. And so I can't give you an exact rate. No one can. And everyone in here is we have individual situations. For instance, some are in a family that have children in the home. That's totally different than me living by myself. You understand? And each of us have our own level of indebtedness. We have set expenses, insurance, and that's going to vary. And it's going to vary as far as the amount of income that we have to spread over these standard expenses that we have, living expenses. And so for me to say, well, you've got to give this amount when you might not have enough food to put on your table, I can't do that. You understand what I'm saying? Uh, but I will say this. I've known people who didn't have a lot and they used it as an excuse not to give anything at all. And I don't think there's ever a reason not to give something. You know, God expects, just as we're commanded to sing and to pray and to observe the Lord's Supper, we're commanded to give. It might be like the widow, it might be 2 mites. But she was blessed because she gave. Barry?
The way I kind of deal with it, when you sit down to write that check out or get that money, you know in your heart if it hurt just a little bit financially, then I think your heart's in the right place and you're going to go ahead and write that check anyway because you're glad that you're still able to do it.
Right. Absolutely. You know, even when I pay my bills, that's the attitude that I have. I'm thankful to God that I have the means where I can pay those bills. And I look at the blessings rather than saying,
That question didn't mean, all this discussion.
well, are you sorry we've had this discussion?
But let me clear something in my mind. The persons that I've heard use the very scripture in Matthew 5, verse 20, to try to press people in the congregation to giving more, I think he was wrong in doing that.
Well, it's an abuse of the scripture if that's your focus and that's the only thing you're applying it to.
Different preachers or speakers that they would use something like that to try to boost up their thought in giving
Right.
and when Fred and I served here as elders, we brought this discussion up one time and we talked about it a lot, and I still say it'll affect people's giving. At the time, I told him, I said, we will see the time because the economy, cost of living was getting fired up at that time.
Right.
To where it was eating up people's retired people,
Right.
their fixed the amount of money that they could give
Right.
to the church.
Right.
And I see that today.
Money doesn't go very far nowadays, does it, Chris?
On the flip side of this, I've actually heard this said. I've witnessed this statement. It wasn't hearsay. When the congregation, leadership, elders, specifically in this case were elders, will not use the money properly or use it at all. This was said. They were putting money in the bank to draw interest and allowing it to accumulate, and would not tell the members how much money was in the account, would not tell how much for whatever reasons, etc. The members said, I can keep that money in my bank account and draw the interest on it myself.
Yeah.
There's a balance to this also. That if the money is being used properly for the Lord's work, not being held, not being viewed as personal, members will give more if more is being done.
That's
Right.
right.
That's exactly right. I've always believed that if the members see good things being done with the money, then they're more likely, if they feel a need for some special project. Right. Right. Right.
Just recently, had an individual to say to me about where they went to church. It wasn't here. Let me make that clear when I start. It was at a big congregation, and they didn't even know what the people in the congregation, the preacher and whoever else got paid, what even they were getting paid. And I thought, that's kind of
That's not right.
for some
No,
reason.
that's not right. There's a good little book about giving. Cleon Laws wrote this, and I think it's You and Your Money, if I'm not badly mistaken. It's been around for a long time, but it has some good information if you enjoy something like that. He has some good insights as far as that's concerned. And I'll make one other comment about giving. Giving to the Lord is basically just one way of giving. We have many other opportunities to give. Uh, I believe it's a good idea for us to be involved in the evangelistic efforts that are available to us, going places that we can't go ourselves. And I could list a whole group of them: In Search of the Lord's Way, Truth for the World, Gospel Broadcasting Network, World Video Bible School, Apologetics Press, the 21st Century Missions that we're all familiar with, that the congregation of Fulton helps to oversee. And we also have the Hispanic work that we've been made to know about, and many others. Plus the children's home. Our command is to take care of orphans, and I don't know of any of us that have an orphan, with the exception of maybe one family in our congregation. Are we doing anything toward helping orphans? We've got certainly the means to do that with Pine Vale Children's Home up in Arkansas. There's one in Springfield. I think those need to be matters of our concern. And in our giving, we need to try as best we can to help in those works as well. And then you're going to be confronted day to day with someone being in need, and you come to be aware of that. And then you step forward and don't just say, "Well, I hope you get what you need," and you don't do anything about it. And so we have those opportunities that we need to take advantage of. Well, we didn't get very far. We'll try to finish this 16th chapter next week unless Jimmy asks another question.
I'm just